Hello everyone, and welcome to a video on the multiple choice questions on the AP test. Now, we saw on the very first morning the structure of the AP test and the multiple choice questions that you see here. They're the first things the students complete on test day. They have a minute per question, 55 questions in minutes. Also, the questions from 1 to 55 go in chronological order. That means the very first question they see will come from the first period that you teach, and they will move throughout the course until the end, Unit 9, or the last time period, which is 1900 to the present. Now, I think it's important to let students know, especially as the AP test approaches, is that they're not required or expected to answer all of these questions correctly. These are difficult questions. Unlike questions on typical tests in high school, which are meant to assess the comprehensive knowledge that students have about a given topic, these questions range from the extremely easy to very, very difficult, and it's simply meant to be able to compare students with each other and also to compare like-minded students from year to year so they can norm the test. In fact, it's extremely rare for a student to get all of the multiple choice questions correct. And in fact, I like to share an anecdote with my students before the test that after the reading, they bring in a committee to set the standards on how the scores on the test are going to be equated into an AP score, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's usually a group of about 6 high school teachers and about 6 college professors, and they take the AP test without having seen it, and then they make the discussions about, okay, well, how many points does it take to make a 4 or a 5, and so on. These college professors don't get 100 on this. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, there was a really well-known professor from a really well-known university in the United States, one of our better schools in the United States, you would know it, who missed 13 questions out of 55. So I like to tell my students that because I don't want them to be taking the AP test and psychologically feel defeated. And what follows from that is if you use AP level questions in your classroom for summative exams, as I do not grade these on a percentage. You will be flooded with parental phone calls. It will be a mess. So I have a scale that I use to translate the raw percentage into a grade. For example, if a student gets a 70, they get 70% of these questions correct. I mean, they're doing pretty well. To me, that's a B in my class. If you want that, I can send that to you. And it's based on data from previous AP tests. Now let's look at what a typical set of questions looks like on the AP test. Here's a good set. Now this is from an earlier time period. We don't study this time period anymore, but this is from a previous test. So you have the quotation here. You have the primary source. And then questions 5, 6, and 7 all pertain in some way to that source. And they would do this as a set. And this is very typical. It's about 3 questions in a set. You may have 2, you may have 4, but it's almost always 3 questions to a set. And if you look at these questions, look at the skills embedded in them. One difficult thing about trying to write these yourself is that one question cannot be a prerequisite, or the knowledge of one question cannot be a prerequisite for asking another question or getting another question correct. A question cannot give any information away that might help a student answer another question in the set. And every question has to assess a different point in the historical development. So these are quite difficult to write ourselves. But if you look here at question number 5, it says, according to the passage, Zhongzi was advocating an approach to governance that most clearly reflected the principles of, and here, having read that text above, a student should see that that's in China, and they should recognize the content of a belief system there, and that would allow them to choose the correct answer, which is C in this case. The skill being assessed here, by the way, is contextualization. A student should read that, see that it's in China, and be able to contextualize this and say that would be Confucianism. Now, if you move on to the next question, it says, Zhongzi's idealized vision of Chinese society in the passage differs most strongly from the social structure of which of the following. You see the skill there. That's a compare-contrast. That's a comparison skill. Students need to determine which of those societies is the opposite of what you see in the passage. And then the third question in the set says, ideas similar to those expressed in the passage have directly contributed to the development of which of the following aspects of later Chinese imperial history. That's basically a causation question. So 3 skills, 1 in each question, and a good solid model example of what a set of questions look like on the AP test. Now there are 3 different styles or types of questions on the AP test. And let's look at those for a minute. We're just going to call them type 1, 2, and 3. So the multiple choice questions will be one of these 3 types of question in terms of the relation to the stimulus. Type 1 is this. Basically, this is just a skill-based question. It doesn't require any historical knowledge. Students just read the stimulus and have to perform a skill with it. It assesses the student's ability to think critically through one of the historical thinking skills or reasoning practices. So students with good reading comprehension are going to knock this out. And I'll also add that the skills in this style of questions are horizontally aligned to the PSAT test and the SAT test, also administered by the College Board. That gives a predictive type of element to the PSAT. The reasoning questions on that test correlate with these skills on the type 1 question. And what that means is there's this program called AP Potential that your AP coordinator knows because they learned about that in training, and AP Potential gives the data. If the student has taken the PSAT test, there's a probability of what they're going to do on the AP test because these skills are horizontally aligned. Now, the second style of question that students might come across is this, and this is just your garden variety. Students analyze content from the stimulus in conjunction with knowledge from the curriculum framework to answer a skill-based question. Most questions on the AP test are type 2, where students have to process the content from the stimulus with something they know from the historical developments and perform a skill like we saw in that last set and reason to the answer. So the most common questions are type 2. And then there's type 3. And really type 3 is a standalone question. A student can simply answer this question without the stimulus. These are limited on the AP test. You won't find a lot of these. And I do want to say that each question set, as I've said, has 3 questions. Don't think that these 3 are all in that set. They're strategically placed throughout the test. You may have one set of questions that's all type 2. Another one that has 2 type 2 and 1 type 1. So this is not an anatomy of a set of questions. It's just the type of questions that students might find on the AP test. I've had students come out of the AP test or take tests in my class on questions that I've drawn from previous AP tests and say, well, I didn't even need the stimulus to answer that question. Or that one seemed like reading comprehension, and that's because there are questions like that on the AP test. So let's model what these questions, these 3 types, would actually look like on the AP test. So here is a stimulus. I'm a Buddhist monk, the admonition of filiality, and if you want to pause and to read the quote, that's fine. Let's look at what a possible type 1 question would look like. This is one that simply assesses students' skill. So here the question is, which of the following is most likely the author's motive in composing the first paragraph of the passage above? Remember, a student should be able to answer this by virtue of the stimulus alone. If they read and process that stimulus, they'll see, well, it's not A, it's not to reinforce traditional obligations of children to the parents. The answer isn't B, they're not trying to replace Chinese culture. Actually, this paragraph is an apology for monks almost, saying, hey, we do filial piety, this respect and obligations to parents. It's just there are 2 different ways to do it, so we're still doing it. So the answer here is D. The purpose here is most likely to explain that monks still perform important duties to their parents, and here's the filial piety. So let's look at a type 2 question. A historian researching belief systems in world history would find this passage most helpful for understanding, and then students would choose this. So they have to look at content in there, so they have to analyze the stimulus, and in conjunction with history that they know, they have to find the right answer. And the right answer here is B. Had any student been taught this, by the way, this is topic 1.1. This is on page 39 in the CED. The 2 historical developments, Chinese cultural traditions continued and they influenced neighboring regions. And then the next one says Buddhism and its core beliefs continued to shape societies in Asia and included a variety of branches, schools, and practices. So there you find the the justification for that question in the CED. All right, a type 3 question, the standalone question. Which of the following was a consequence of the diffusion of Buddhism across Asia in the period 1200 to 1450? Note, the stimulus here is not needed at all to answer that question. And again, these are limited on the AP test, but the answer here would be C, the establishment of Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia. And here's the location of that in the CED. This is on page 43 of the course and exam description, and it's topic 1.1. State formation and development demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, including new Hindu and Buddhist states that emerged in South and Southeast Asia. So there are 3 styles of questions on the AP test. Now, I want to note that there is a strong correlation now between how students perform on the multiple choice section of the test and their essay scores. 6 or 8 years ago, actually, there wasn't a correlation. The student might do really well on one component and not well on the other. And a lot of that is because there's this thing in psychometrics, the science of testing, called test wiseness. And test wiseness, it refers to those students who do well on tests because they see things in it, they have some insight or this intuition that allows them to do better. You know, you've seen this in class, when that kid who doesn't do the reading and doesn't do the work makes a good grade, and then Susie, who studied for 3 hours every night, makes a lower grade, and she's really upset about that. There is such a thing as test wiseness. So if you look at these questions, notice that they're all the answers, that the correct answer is called the key, and the other ones are called the distractors. So A, B, C, D. The key and distractors are all grammatically parallel. The answers are roughly the same length. If a student sees one answer that's a lot longer than the others, they're probably going to think, oh, you know, that's the answer, because that's what a poorly written multiple choice test looks like. And if one has a different verb tense, if they're all passive tense and one is in the active tense, a student will just pick that out. A test-wise student will simply pick that out and select the correct answer. So there has been a great deal of effort on the AP test to get rid of test wiseness, and it's been quite successful. That means that the skills on the multiple choice test kind of give insight into the ranges that students should earn on the written part of the test. So sometimes even at the reading, if an essay scored and it's way outside of that range, they may bring the essay back and have a teacher read it again. Now, interestingly, the one advantage that they have not been able to factor out on the AP test, on the multiple choice, is reading comprehension. That's a natural or learned advantage. And students who have higher levels of reading comprehension, of course this goes without saying, are going to do better on the AP test. And that means that a lot of your students' success comes from what happened before they ever made it into your class. This goes back to the middle school teachers. Anyway, there are a few other suggestions for taking the AP test that I want to talk about that come from the fact of the 3 styles of questions that we've seen, and also some research-based practices that I want to share as well that you might tell your students about. I remember in 2012, when they first went to this style of multiple choice, the multiple choice questions used to rarely have stimuli. They simply ask a question and students answered it. And they went to this style of multiple choice in 2012. And when the test was over, my best student came out and said, I didn't finish. He didn't finish the multiple choice. And I thought, oh my goodness. And this student, by the way, 2 years later went on to be our valedictorian. He did make a 5 on the AP test. But if he didn't finish, I thought, what in the world was this going to be like? What happened was, and some of the sets of questions had 4 and 5 questions in a set. What happened was students were going back and rereading the stimulus for every single question, and they weren't finishing. So I think a good strategy is this. When a student gets a set, when they approach a set of multiple choice questions, the first thing that they should do is read at least one, maybe the first question stem. So read question 1 here, and then maybe read question 2 as well. And then look back to the stimulus, and now you're doing what's called purposed reading. Now they're looking in the stimulus for something. And by the way, there's a chance that the question that they read can be answered without the stimulus. There is that style of question. So if they can answer without the stimulus, boom, they're done. Read the next question and then go back and look at the stimulus. That will ensure that they get through the test in the given amount of time, which is 55 minutes. A couple of other test tips. One is students who skip questions and come back to them usually don't get them correct. There's also this problem of messing up the numbering, and that happened to a student of mine once. He skipped the question, and at the end of the test, he realized it, and he wanted to go back and erase everything and move it up. And of course, when they call time, you can't do that. This student would have probably made a 4 or 5 on the AP test and ended up doing very badly on the multiple choice question. And that's not just anecdotal. Psychometric studies tell us that when students skip questions and try to go back, they rarely get them correct. I mean, if a student doesn't know anything about the Mughal Empire at 8:45 in the morning, they're not going to know anything about it at 9:45. So the best thing they can do is just answer the best they can and then move on. And another thing is, and if you've been teaching for a while, you know this, tell your students not to go back and change answers. Usually, the first thing that pops out to them is the correct answer, and then they mull over it and they analyze it, and then they go back and they change it to something that's not right. Almost always, when they change an answer that they've already marked, they're going to get it wrong. So what is the best way to prepare for the AP stimulus-based multiple choice questions? Well, first of all, and I put this in previous videos, students need to annotate the CED. I'll deal with this in another video. Give them pages from the CED with the historical developments and have them annotate right on it. Also, teach content in a way that sticks to the language of the historical developments. On day 1, we saw the correlation between the CED and the multiple choice questions. If you can align your teaching with the language of that, your students are going to do very well on this. And another thing is just have them practice this a lot in class. There are several release tests that you can use. Also, we now have this thing called AP Classroom. We will deal with that this week. There's a massive test bank where you can log in and you can set the search features and extract questions based on certain criteria. So you can pick questions on topic 1, 2, and 2, 3, however you arrange to teach the class, and it will produce these style questions. And it's a good idea to practice those in class as much as you can. And then your students will be successful on the AP test. So that is the end of this video, and I will see you guys next time.